We all know Don Vito Corleone, the Godfather, the powerful Mafia boss known for his cunning and wisdom, intelligence, and possessing an aura of power and respect. A charismatic leader that started with nothing and that built an empire. He had all the characteristics that powerful people aspire to possess. Essentially, in the world of the Mafia, he was the perfect Don, mastering the balance of controlling and pulling the strings of power in both the streets and the criminal underworld. But what if I told you there is one particular real-life mobster that heavily inspired the character of Don Vito? A real Don who relied more on his intelligence rather than muscle to get what he wanted. This was the notorious Frank Costello, one of the original godfathers of the Mafia.
Costello was the ultimate diplomat, the ultimate Machiavellian. He was the chess man who could move the pieces around the board.
Alongside the likes of Lucky Luciano, Bugsy Siegel, Vito Genovese, and Arnold Rothstein, Frank Costello would be an essential player in creating something that had never been done before. They managed to somehow organize crime, going from running small bootlegging operations to controlling entire cities and spreading their influence even abroad. They created a newer and much more powerful criminal organization the United States had ever seen. Making offers they couldn't refuse, Costello would build a network of powerful people, all owing him favors, which is what allowed Costello to have judges, businessmen, politicians, officers, you name it, all in his pocket like nickels and dimes.
He had politicians and judges and district leaders who had police chiefs and cops and detectives. That's how he had the whole town in his pocket.
The ultimate Machiavellian, mastering the game of power, Costello would rise to become one of the most powerful and definitely one of the most influential dons in the history of Cosa Nostra.
People came to him like people in the old days of France, when they would come before the king asking for a boon. Well, he didn't have a palace. He would be at the Waldorf Astoria.
But soon, Costello attempted to move more and more into the legitimate world, creating an image of a sophisticated businessman, attempting to finally remove himself from that dark and deceitful world, leaving behind all the Machiavellian scheming and treachery that comes with it. But as he grew in power and wealth, so did his troubles. His reign over the criminal underworld was filled with plots, assassinations, betrayal, and the full wrath of the law, as well as the streets. This is the story of the rise and eventual fall of one of the most notorious and influential figures in the history of Cosa Nostra. Francesco Castiglia was born in Calabria in 1891, but he grew up in the streets of East Harlem after his family moved to the United States in 1895. It wouldn't take long until Francesco found himself entering the world of crime, as by the age of 13 he was already part of a local gang and soon changed his name to Frank Costello. Frank would commit various petty thefts here and there. However, there was one incident that would become one of the most pivotal moments in his entire life. In 1915, he was caught and served a whole year behind bars for carrying a concealed weapon. And from that point onwards, he vowed to never again need to carry a weapon to get what he wanted. Rather, learn to use his brains and build his empire. But one of the biggest turning points that would change everything came after he met a young and ambitious Sicilian, later known as Charles Lucky Luciano. Like Frank, Luciano was extremely ambitious and had his eyes set on building an empire, completely transforming the criminal underworld to fit his vision. They were not interested in upholding the same traditions and rules set out by the old Mustache Pete's.
Change is coming.
With their shared vision and aspirations, they developed a friendship and would work together to build an empire in the criminal underworld. Frank would ascend the ranks as he developed more and more elaborate rackets. He learned how to capitalize on gambling schemes from a true master, a man who built a bookmaking empire and was New York's most powerful racketeer, Arnold the Brain Rothstein. Frank learned a lot from Rothstein, but perhaps the most important lesson he took away was the power of political protection. He taught Frank how to use money rather than threats to buy influence and power, making him untouchable. When Prohibition came into effect in 1920, that knowledge would become essential in building their bootlegging empire. With the backing of Rothstein, Costello, as well as Luciano and his associates, would go on to make a fortune, at the same time growing their power and influence. Costello would continuously innovate his operations, always looking for the most efficient way to run his empire. And unlike some of the other bootleggers, Frank ran his empire as if it were a Fortune 500 company, well organized, with departments responsible for different aspects of his operations. He was now building quite a reputation, earning the respect and admiration of his peers, as well as the gratitude of his countrymen. In 1927, he returned to his hometown in Calabria, where the word of his reputation and success made him be welcomed as a hero. He was accepting so many requests and granting so many favors that by the end, the townspeople wanted to rename the town after him. But Frank was just getting started. They couldn't have predicted that this was only the beginning of Costello's rise in power and wealth, as he would end up playing a crucial role in establishing the American Mafia. Although Frank had built a solid reputation as a moneymaker, what really separated him from the rest was skills as a Mafia diplomat, a peacemaker ready to resolve their issues through mostly non-violent means.
He could bring bitter enemies together as the mediator, and when he wanted to accomplish something, he could bring everyone together and convince them that it was in all of their interests.
Using his political connections and influence, Costello became the link between the criminal and the legitimate world, and became known as the Prime Minister of the mob. Noticing Frank's unique skills, he would become one of Luciano's closest advisors. Luciano was planning something revolutionary, and so wanted to surround himself with those most capable of helping him achieve this goal. He wanted to lead a new generation of mobsters that didn't need to be constrained by the same traditions and rules set out by the old mustache Petes. And soon, they would strike, forever changing the course of American history. All he needed was the right opportunity. Soon, the opportunity they needed would soon present itself. It was finally time to revolutionize the criminal underworld. In early 1930, the two most powerful New York mob bosses, Giuseppe Masseria, known as Joe the Boss, and his rival Salvatore Maranzano, went to war.
My fellow citizens, we are at war.
A power struggle of who will declare himself the boss of all bosses. But following the Castellamarese War, it was Luciano and his associates who in the end came out on top. But with the two major bosses taken out, the criminal underworld was about to descend into chaos. Luciano would exploit this opportunity to swiftly take over, and to avoid more of this constant fighting and betrayals, Lucky would establish the Commission.
There's no boss. There's 7 bosses. A commission.
After the two major bosses were taken out, Luciano called a meeting in Chicago, where he abolished the title of Capo di tutti capi, or Boss of all bosses, as whoever held the title basically put a giant target on their back, and to avoid the mistake of his predecessors, this was a smart move to make. The commission would act as a governing body, consisting of a board of directors, 7 bosses overseeing all mafia activities in the United States. It was the best way to mediate and prevent future conflicts between the families that hurt their bottom line. Luciano was appointed chairman of the commission, although they didn't really have a choice. Dividing the power among the bosses would make them work together instead of constantly fighting to be on top.
You will not give, I'll take.
But also allowed them to secure their own positions from being taken by those within their own families. The commission held the power of approving a new boss before he could officially take over. The New York 5 families also decided all new members must be approved by the other families.
Nobody gets made unless we all approve.
After the new proposed member was approved by the other families, he could become a made man. Lucky established a new crime family, with him as its Don, Vito Genovese as the underboss, and Frank as his consigliere. Although Genovese was technically more powerful than Costello, Frank was exponentially rising as the Luciano crime family's biggest earner, building his own sphere of influence. Costello and his associates would be instrumental in expanding the Mafia's rackets, from slot machines and bootlegging to establishing entire casinos all across the US. And then from a small town that would become Las Vegas all the way to Havana, Cuba. They even began branching into oil, real estate, and Wall Street. Slowly, Frank became rather more and more interested in building wealth in the legitimate world, rubbing elbows with the upper echelons of New York society. Costello, unlike other crime bosses or gangsters, knew how to conduct himself depending on who he was with and where he was.
He could walk with kings but not lose the common touch. He was just as good at a card table with 4 or 5 wise guys as he was with judges, politicians.
This allowed him to build a range of relationships with individuals in 2 quite different worlds. Costello was obsessed with carving a particular image. He wanted a reputation of excellence, indulging in the finer things of life. He lived in one of the most luxurious apartment buildings in New York, as well as spending his time in his Long Island home, a place where he could relax, play golf at his country club, and host dinner parties with some of his powerful friends. To put it simply, he didn't hesitate in enjoying the fruits of his labor. But Frank was yet to reach the height of his power and wealth. He was about to ascend to the very top. In 1936, Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. He then named his underboss Vito Genovese as the acting Don. Genovese and Costello had a somewhat tense relationship, which later on turned deadly. But for now, things were somewhat stable. Luciano still attempted to run the empire behind bars, trying to maintain some sort of control, but it would turn out a lot more difficult than he initially thought, and things were about to get a bit more complicated. Only a few months later, Genovese had fled to Italy to avoid prosecution in a murder case, so now Luciano needed to find someone else he could trust to take over before it was too late. There was quite a lot of pressure on Luciano. Maintaining control over a vast and complex criminal empire was already difficult enough. Even with the systems and structure Luciano developed, it was still incredibly fragile, since he was not there in person to make sure it was operating accordingly. He was in a very bad position. His empire and grip over the underworld could start to slip away. So he needed someone from the outside to maintain control. But again, there's a problem. As we mentioned, his underboss, Genovese, was also in trouble with the law and on the run, and now needed to find someone else. But the thing is, whoever he chose would determine the fate of his empire forever. There was a lot riding on this decision. He needed to make sure whoever he appointed would not betray his trust, because if he chose the wrong person, they could use his absence to consolidate power over the family, and do what Luciano did many years prior, cutting him out, and maybe even worse. Also, it's important to note that there was a lot of pressure on whoever was appointed to that position, as he would have a giant target on his back, and if he was seen to be as weak enough, a rival family could sweep in and take over. Luckily, over the years, Luciano had a few loyal men that he could count on, and so this is exactly why Costello was the perfect candidate. Frank was Luciano's consigliere and longtime friend. They literally built the empire together and had been through quite a lot. But that was still not enough for Luciano to be willing to risk losing his empire. He needed to make sure it was a calculated risk. So all of that aside, one of the biggest reasons Frank was the best option for Luciano was the fact that he already was in an incredibly powerful position and enjoyed all the benefits that came with it. He was also one of the biggest earners in the family and was actually trying to clean up his image. Therefore, he really didn't have much interest in becoming the boss or betraying Luciano's trust and risking tarnishing his reputation forever. Additionally, Costello already possessed all the skills needed to make sure he kept everyone in check. He was highly respected, and his likability allowed him to keep things under control. So basically, he had both the skills and personality to keep the empire under control. On top of that, was incredibly loyal, and it would be highly unlikely that Costello would end up betraying Luciano. And so, Luciano had no better option. Frank had masterfully used the laws of power to his advantage, and therefore was given the power so many others crave on a silver platter. So Luciano appointed Frank as the new acting boss. Costello, already having built his reputation, allowed him to effortlessly take over with minimal objection from all the other made men or the other families. However, this news would inflame Genovese's hatred for Frank, making him a target, creating a rivalry that would soon start a civil war within the family. But Genovese had bigger problems to deal with, and so for the time being couldn't do anything about it. Costello's new underboss was his cousin Willie Moretti, who according to some sources happened to be the godparent to the then relatively unknown singer Frank Sinatra. Allegedly, Moretti helped Sinatra in releasing him from his contract with the band leader Tommy Dorsey. With his increasing power and wealth, Costello was now undoubtedly part of New York's upper class, socializing with celebrities, government officials, and wealthy businessmen, but at the same time still keeping an eye on the streets. As boss, Costello was well liked by the family. His political influence allowed him to generate a lot of money for the family. But his reign as boss was by no means an easy ride. Things would get a lot more intense for Frank. As boss, Costello was now one of the most powerful men in New York, maybe even the country, enjoying all the luxuries and benefits that come with it. Unfortunately for him, there does come a hefty price, and his biggest challenges were yet to come. Frank found the responsibilities of becoming a crime boss quite a burden. He was already making a ton of money without the headaches of running a criminal empire, and all of the Machiavellian scheming and treachery that comes with it. As any other powerful man in a similar position, he made some powerful enemies. His reign would be filled with plots, assassinations, betrayal, and the full wrath of the law, as well as the streets.
In mob terms, he was probably a little too nice a guy. Sooner or later, he was going to be pushed out of the way by somebody who was more violent.
Instead of becoming invincible, Frank would become a target for both the law and those in the criminal underworld. He wanted to shake off the mafioso image and reputation, becoming known as a sophisticated businessman. But his attempts of leaving the world behind him and entering the legitimate one would not come to fruition. All this would take a huge toll on Costello, but he would somehow survive, achieving something that very few in a dark and deceitful world managed to do. In the next video, we'll unravel the events that transpired after Costello became the Don, his intense rivalry with Vito Genovese, and how he used his power and influence to pull strings of power to get what he wanted, and how he did something that no other mafia boss was able to do.